And we are a 10 years old university, and we believe in interdisciplinary education. And our approach is entirely different. So when we have a topic like this, where we are going to discuss about national education policy, being a part of Ahmedabad University, one feels that you're already part of this national education policy. We have been practicing this. Our approach is entirely different. We believe in interdisciplinarity and experiential learning. So I'll begin the introduction today and quickly do the introduction, and then after that I'll hand it over to both the speakers for which people are here. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Karthik Muralidharan. As Professor Ravi Miglani said, that it seemed that I know you for a long time because I have been listening to you and reading your articles. He's a Tata Chancellor Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. Born and raised in India, Professor Muralidharan earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard University and an MPhil in economics from Cambridge University. He has a PhD too in economics from Harvard University. His research spans development, public and labor economics with a focus on improving the effectiveness of public spending in the social sector, which includes education, health, and social protection programs. His research program is characterized by large-scale randomized experiments conducted in partnership with government to study the impact of programs and policies at scale. Professor Muralidharan is a research associate of the NBER. He's also on the board of directors of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, where he is co-chair of the Education Research Program and a fellow and board member of the Bureau of Economic Analysis of Development. He's actively involved in policy advising and capacity building in India at both the central and state government level. He writes regular columns on economic policy for the Hindustan Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and The Economist, and teaches a popular course on the Indian economy at University of UCSD. So this is our immense pleasure. I'm really pleased to have you, Professor Karthik Muralidharan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
The person who will be in conversation with Professor Muralidharan is Professor Ravi Miglani. He's a professor of practice of management at Ahmedabad University. He's also the director of Global Executive MBA in Pharmaceutical Management. He has a 35 years experience in the field of marketing research and consumer insight, and has worked across various domains of market research, consumer behavior, customer engagement. He did his postgraduate program in management from IIM Ahmedabad way back in 1983. At Ahmedabad University, he's creating courses and programs in the area of marketing research and other related disciplines. And he is also coordinating our conversation series effort. So thank you so much to both of you. And now I request you to begin the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Sudhir. And before coming to you, Karthik, I think I would like to thank all our audience who have shown up in large numbers. We know that these are not good times in most places where all of you are and all of us are. The situation outside your door is not good. And in spite of the tensions, and I'm sure many of you would be facing dire situations in and around your networks, you have decided to spend a Saturday evening with us. So we are really grateful. That is very encouraging to take time off all the chaos that's going on around us, which we hope will be over soon. So welcome again, Karthik. And in a way, welcome back home, because I believe you grew up in Ahmedabad. So Ahmedabad, you are an Ahmedabad boy. So welcome back home. And as we were saying off camera, do come back here in the flesh sometime soon when there is less of a chaos outside. We hope to see you here soon. So welcome to the webinar. We will talk mainly about education. And as those quick poll questions showed, a lot of our audience believe that education, especially school education and especially primary school education, is in dire need of reform. So we will all listen to you keenly on that. But before coming to that, as Sudhir was listing your achievements, your research journey has been amazing. You have done not just research as a scholar, but you are what people call, and I think I've seen you call yourself, an economist with dirty shoes. I can't see your shoes now on Zoom, but so we would like you to explain what is economist with dirty shoes and what is fieldwork based economics that you do rather than some other kinds of economic research that other academics might be doing. So if you can take us through the journey and how you got your shoes dirty.
Thank you, Ravi, and it's a great pleasure to be like you said, virtually back home. Ahmedabad is where I spent the first 16 years of my life. I still did my schooling there, have tons of friends there, and so it's wonderful to be back virtually. So I think the personal journey in terms of in getting into economics really happened at age 16, where I'm born in 75, and so when economic liberalization was happening, I just couldn't stop reading about it, and that's how I got into it. But then, as an undergrad, taking development economics, Amartya Sen was at Harvard when I was there, and I think that created a big interest in human development as a focus of where I would do my work. And then, in many ways, I think the research career has been serendipitously influenced by what's been going on in the field of development economics, right? So I think in the 80s and 90s, or even before that, a lot of the work used to be theoretical, and people would just write models of different kinds of poverty traps and maybe work with secondary data, with NSS data and other kinds of data sets. But I came of age as a researcher at a time when RCTs were kind of just starting to be done, and when JPAL was being formed. And so I think the piece about dirty shoes comes from the fact that we realized that we had so many theories and not enough evidence, that as a profession, I think we pivoted towards really saying, it's not just enough to write these elaborate theories. We really need data from the field to understand what's going on. But it's not just data in terms of, simple surveys, but data that is mapped into theory with some sense of where the binding constraints to development are. So if you think about what is development economics, what makes development economics different from growth economics, or what makes development economics different from anti-poverty programs, conceptually, what makes development economics different is the idea of a poverty trap, right? The fact that so when you say macro development economics, if you take the solo growth model, poor countries should automatically grow faster, just because when you're poorer, you have higher returns to capital, and it's easier to imitate technologies than to innovate new technology, right? But you still have many countries that get stuck in poverty traps and don't grow fast, right? So development economics at a macro level is about understanding what are the institutional factors that hold countries back. Similarly, development economics at a micro level, when you look at this at the level of an individual, is what keeps people stuck in poverty traps that allow, and what might be the policy interventions that may allow you to get people out of those traps. And it's really hard to kind of make progress on this without spending time in the field and understanding and talking to people and seeing how our institutions are functioning. And so my own kind of journey into dirty shoes really happened in about 2002, when I started with this all India study on the quality of public service delivery in education and health across about 19 states. And so in the middle of my PhD, in my second year, I came and spent close to 3 or 4 months in India doing field work across a range of states in education. And I think that's kind of how the field-based focus of my work started. And then, over the years, it's been about education, health, NREGA, PDS. Now I'm doing some work on ICDS. So it's all of the major social welfare programs of the government of India. So at heart, I'm a public finance economist. That's kind of my core training, but it's public finance and development, and with a focus on improving the effectiveness of how the state itself functions in these kind of core development sectors.
Great. I believe this journey went on beyond research into policy, but let's come back to that. Let's, I think, not keep our audience waiting. Let's talk about education, which people are here to listen to. But I think we might cycle back to where that dirty shoes led you later. So let's talk about education. I'm, as you might know from my background, I'm an industry person, a corporate life person. I'm not an academic. I've been trying to become an academic for the last 2 years, and since then I've been reading fair amount on what's wrong with our education system and so on. And a lot of the things that I read sound like good news to layman like me. There's been huge growth, like some of those graphs which you yourself have been showing in various forums, huge growth in school building, huge growth in student enrollment, like orders of magnitude more students are enrolled in schools now. There is teacher numbers are up, teacher salaries are up. Everything that could look good is looking good. So why are you not happy?
So I think, so before we start kind of sounding, talking about the glass half empty, I think you're right. It is important to first and foremost acknowledge the massive successes we've had, right? I mean, so I think the glass half full story is that, we have made remarkable progress in the last 30 years in terms of school enrollment, right? I mean, and now to be fair, I think we were late, right? We were late compared to East Asia, who invested in primary education intensely soon after independence, right? So I think India's early education system was, and so you can see, in fact, the long-term shadow of our education investments in the structure of the economy itself, right? So basically, India started out with a greater emphasis on tertiary education relative to GDP per capita, right? Because again, if you go to the primitives of how education helps development, if your belief is that what really matters is adoption of new technologies, then you may prioritize tertiary education as a way of saying we need a technically educated manpower to be able to absorb the advanced technologies, right? Which is instinctively, I think, what the founding fathers in the Indian system did, right? So we have this reasonably high quality tertiary education system with focus on technical partnerships with, to set up the IITs and the IIMs. And so we did a good job on that. But what we did was neglect school education, right? I mean, compared to East Asia. And so we woke up later to the importance of school education. I think in the 50s and 60s and even 70s, we really didn't do that much. I think, it's really starting in the 80s that we started putting a lot more emphasis on school education at the national level. And you can see the shadow of those education investments in the structure of our economy even today, right? So one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons we do poorly in kind of, low skill intensive manufacturing that would be labor intensive and create lots of jobs lots of lower skill jobs is partly even the lower skill factory floor jobs require a certain basic level of education and ability to process and function on a shop floor. And we do much worse than our East Asian counterparts at that, right? But where the part of the manufacturing spectrum that India still does well at is the part that is much more technically intense, manufacturing on obviously pharmaceuticals and software and all of the much more human capital intensive sectors. So, and that the fact that we have those now, of course, there are other reasons for that, including everything from SSIs to regulations that kick in at larger firm sizes. But there is also the shadow of the education investments we made, right? I mean, that we and you can see how that plays out now. So I think coming back to your question, the good news on education in India is the enrollments have certainly shot up. Certainly, there's been massive increases in inputs in school construction. Now, the problem, and in fact, maybe what I'll do is I'll just take 5 minutes, right? I need to share a couple of slides and just kind of use this as a way to walk people through the core results, right? I mean, so so the key background facts on education in India is that, there have been considerable successes in school enrollment, at this point over the past 25 odd years. But the glass half full is that these increases in enrollment have not really translated much into improved learning outcomes. Okay. So, and it's not just the Pratham Asar, which is measured almost annually in rural India. It's also there in the National Achievement Survey, in the School Learning Survey, which was done by Education Initiatives. When India took the PISA, I think we were second from the bottom. So, it doesn't matter what data set you look at, that we have a crisis of low levels of learning outcomes. And and in a way, you can't even blame the policymakers, right? Because, if you look at the great development debates we were having in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it used to be about sectoral allocation. How much money do you allocate to different sectors, right? Do you prioritize human development first? Do you prioritize economic infrastructure first? So at one level, you can think about even the Bhagwati Sen kind of debates on development in the 70s and 80s as saying, everybody wants both income growth and human development, right? The question was, what do you prioritize first? And so, the Bhagwati odd view was to say that if you manage to get your economic development going first, then that higher income will automatically translate into better human development. The Sen and Dres view has been that you don't need to wait to get rich before you can get developed, where developed is defined primarily in terms of human development, right? Of education and health, and would point to examples of saying that, focused public investment will help improve outcomes. Okay. Now, but my point of departure from both of them is that, in a way, I feel that this macro discussion about where you spend your money is taking away attention from the much more important discussion of the quality of your expenditure, right? So we focus on the sectoral allocations, but we don't focus enough on the effectiveness of the spending in a given sector, right? So if you take a production possibility frontier analogy, we are so inefficient in our public expenditure that we are operating way within the feasible set. And so that improving efficiency will allow you to do more of everything, right? As opposed to arguing about the top line of the discussion. Okay, so coming back to, therefore, what we've learned from the research, because, again, to be fair to the original debates and development, we simply didn't have the research and evidence that we have now about 25 years ago, right? So, and till recently, and even now, many parts of the global development community measure your commitment to a sector by your spending. Okay, so we measure our commitment to education by how much we are spending. Okay, and what you see is that this large increase in spending do not seem to have helped improve learning outcomes that much, and some components may have even hurt. And I'll come and tell you why. And again, schooling, if we want to kind of reach our goals in education, it's really about learning outcomes, because being in school without learning anything, which is what we'll see, is really not that useful for what we're trying to achieve as a country, both at the macro level of growth and at the micro level of inclusion, right? Because the goal of inclusive growth means you want aggregate growth to be high, but you also want people to participate in this growth process in a broad-based way, right? So however you look at this, education is a critical investment to allow us to get to that goal. Now, one of the things you're seeing in terms of the weakness in the public systems is this large-scale exit to private schools. So, even without my data and research, if you just use a revealed preference metric of what people are saying, it is that, the market share of private schools, fee-charging private schools, is over 50% in urban India and about 35% in rural India. So, there's kind of a voting with your feet element of, what people are thinking about public schooling, but this is no panacea. So if we have time, I'll talk about the research on private schools. And overall, the punchline is that the private schools are slightly better, but once you control for parental characteristics, right, and household socioeconomic factors, it's not really that much better. It's slightly better, but not that much better. Okay, so and I've been saying this for about 15 or 20 years, and I'm almost concerned now that I used to keep saying that we're at the risk of turning this demographic dividend to a demographic disaster. I would say we're already there. I would say every year we're putting out close to 10 million children graduating from our primary school systems who are not able to read at a second grade level, and which means that if you finish primary schooling without being able to read, your schooling is pretty much over. Okay, because at that point you're sitting in class, and as I showed famously in the podcast, whatever the teacher is saying really doesn't mean anything, because you have kind of essentially fallen so far behind that the time in school is not having much impact. Okay, so what I'll do very, very quickly is, so this is then the mapping between education spending and outcomes, where you see that the spending has kind of gone up almost threefold. Even inflation adjusted, it's gone up more than double. And the learning outcomes, if anything, seem to be flat. And the bad news here is that business as usual is just not working. Okay, so I'm not going to get into each of these research results, but the four big items we spend on. We spend on infrastructure and facilities, okay? And for the most part, we see very little correlation between facilities and learning outcomes, okay? And what's going on? So there are three possible explanations, right? One is that it's possible that the facilities make schooling more pleasant. Okay, it's more fun to be in a room that has lights and fans and electricity. So this is not gainsaying the importance of the consumption value of the infrastructure, but the learning outcomes clearly don't seem to depend. In fact, and now that there are so many university faculty here, it's a very powerful example. So there's this lovely paper by Fabian Waldinger, which I'll send you guys. He's looking at university productivity in Germany, okay, post World War II Germany. And what he does is he uses the fact that during World War II, there were random bombings that caused some universities to lose all of their buildings. Okay, so you get a random exogenous shock to the quality of your physical infrastructure, where some universities lost all of their buildings. Whereas other universities that had a higher fraction of Jewish faculty before the World War, lost a lot more of their faculty, right? And what he finds is that 10 years after World War II, the universities that lost their buildings have completely recovered, okay? Because it was easy to just put the money to do the buildings. But 50 years after World War II, the universities that lost their eminent faculty had still not recovered, right? And so, as a vice chancellor, when we think about where we put our resources in the university, the challenge, of course, is that the buildings is what people see, right? You don't see the quality of instruction and pedagogy nearly as much. Okay, but what the research suggests is that's what really matters, much as the building is kind of what catches our attention. Okay, so now, again, so that's on infrastructure. Again, I'm not going to say don't build the infrastructure, right? Obviously, you need certain basic minimum characteristics, but the data is very clear that it may be necessary but not sufficient. Okay, and so that's not going to get you where you need to get. And then we can talk more about teacher quality and training. And the bad news here is there's not a single study, okay, that finds a positive correlation between teacher training programs and learning outcomes. And this is very depressing, right? Because the core of our RTE and even many of our education policy documents has been saying we need to put trained teachers in every classroom. Okay. Now, there are many reasons for why this training doesn't seem to matter. I think one big part is that some of these degrees are just fake. Okay, so you've got fake credentials, because what the research is studying is, does it make a difference if you have a teacher with a credential versus not, right? I mean, so if it's fake, it's not going to matter. But I think even when the degree is real, one of the problems is that most of our teacher training credentials, if you look at the content analysis of the curriculum, you'll find that it's mainly doing history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, but very little of actual pedagogy of how do you teach in a classroom. Okay, and so given that essentially teaching is a practical vocation, right? Meaning that the structure of our training is, in fact, I used to be on the faculty of the Harvard Education School, right? And if you look at the top education schools in the world, they're a little bit like Noah's Ark, okay? So that you have two of every discipline, okay, coming and reproducing their own discipline. So, you'll have economists of education, sociologists of education, learning psychologists, and everybody comes and teaches their little piece. But you're really kind of teaching the disciplines as opposed to teaching pedagogy, which is something that, we need to pay more attention to. So anyway, I can go on a lot about additional factors, but let me just point out, the four big things that we spend our money on and where, why it doesn't seem to matter. And because it doesn't really alleviate a binding constraint, which is what I'll come to in a moment. Okay, so same with class sizes. Okay, so in the RTE, we spend an enormous amount of money, about 25,000 crores a year, hiring more teachers to reduce the PTR, pupil teacher ratio, from 40:1 to 30:1. Okay, and again, what the evidence shows is that some of this matters, but it's not nearly as effective as other things. And then same with student inputs, right? Midday meals, books, uniforms, materials. So again, I'm not going to say we should not do these things. Okay, these are from a pure humanitarian perspective. I think it's important to do the school feeding program. But again, the point is not to say that don't do this. The point is to say that by itself, this is not giving you the gains and learning outcomes that you need. Okay, so this is a very depressing slide because this is 95% of our education establishment expenditure is these four line items. Okay, infrastructure, training, teacher salaries, and different kinds of student inputs. And if I'm telling you that none of this seems to matter, then you may ask, okay, is it completely hopeless? Okay, like what should we be doing? Now, the good news is that we have two broad classes of interventions where we have consistent evidence that this has a positive impact. Okay, and the first is just broadly what I call governance. Okay, so governance, and particularly in the public schooling system. Now, I think in private schools and private universities, you definitely have more accountability. But one of the big problems in the public system is just how low the accountability is. Okay, so, and this has been a big part of my early work on teacher absence and stuff. But, I think even more than absence, the fact that we spend most of our money on unconditional salary increases. And, we've seen now tons of studies that show there is just basically zero correlation between simply increasing salary and any meaningful metric of performance. Whereas if you manage to do even a modest amount of pay that is linked to performance in a appropriately defined way, right? I mean, and again, in a business school, this will all sound very logical, right? I mean, it's just that our public sector doesn't operate like, always in the most logical ways. But the bottom line is, and forget even performance pay, wo to dur ki baat hai, right? I mean, that requires measuring performance. I'm talking about even basic supervision, right? Is your block education officer position filled? Okay. So if you look at the data on absence, what we see is that schools that have been visited by a superior officer at least once in the last 3 months have a significantly lower level of absence. But whereas you see on average about 20 to 30% of these block and district education positions are often vacant, and the tenures are so short. The average DEO position in many states in the north is less than 1 year because people are getting transferred so often. So the basic building blocks of governance in terms of management and supervision is completely broken. And this is not stuff that we see sitting in our state capitals. Okay, so that's one piece where it's so broken that even modest investments in governance, okay, will give you a big benefit. Now, the second piece, which is perhaps even more striking, is the fact that is pedagogy, okay, is what is happening inside the classroom and how are we teaching, okay. And the fundamental problem here is that the textbooks and curricula were designed for a time when schooling was far from universal. So we had built this whole system for a time when only the top 20% of the demographic distribution, or 30%, was in the schooling system. And so you have now tens of millions of first generation learners who have come into the schooling system who do not have the support at home, and they fall behind very, very fast. Okay. So if you think about almost anybody attending this call, this talk, if your kids are in a private school, you start with LKG and UKG, right? Whereas the government system will start in class 1. And so you don't even have those 2 years of foundational learning. And so when you come in, if you don't have any support at home or in the school, you fall behind very fast. And once you fall behind, then it doesn't matter what I'm doing with teacher training or instruction or resources, because the material I'm covering is at a completely different level that is above your head. Okay. So here is this picture, okay, which I consider one of the most important pictures for understanding education in India. Okay. And this is now, it's a pattern in the data we've seen in Delhi, we've seen in Rajasthan, we've seen in Madhya Pradesh, we've seen in Telangana. So in multiple states where we're working, this, there might be some variation, but the core message is the same. Okay. And so basically, if you look at the left-hand side of this picture, so this is based on a representative sample of over 5,000 students in Rajasthan, across 4 districts. So what you see in the X, and these are government schools. Okay. So what you see in the X-axis is what is the grade that the child is enrolled in as you go from class 1 to class 8. And the Y-axis is telling you what is the true learning level of this child, right? Now, if this child is making progress at the rate of the curriculum in the textbook, then you would be on that 45-degree line. Okay. Now, in practice, where you are is more like that red line. Okay. So the rate of progress is about half of what is envisaged in the curriculum, which is why if I look at an average 8th standard child in a government school today, their true learning level is more at a 4th grade level. Okay. Now, and you don't often see this, partly because a lot of these children will drop out before taking the board exam, right? So because the first external standard happens at 10th standard, right? So you don't quite see this because that's where the dropouts happen. But I think what is even more striking about this figure, and it gives you a sense of why teaching is so difficult, right, is every dot in this picture is a graph. It represents about 10 children. And the way this kind of graph itself is made is, credit to Education Initiatives, which is an Ahmedabad-based edtech company. And I think, they've now moved to Bangalore. Is, simply from a measurement perspective, what the system is able to do is it can dynamically calibrate the question difficulty, right? So if you're an 8th standard kid, I give you an 8th standard question. If you get it wrong, then I give you a 7th standard. I keep going down and down and dynamically adjusting the level of the content till you're able to get it right. And that's what allows the system to pinpoint what is your true learning level. Okay. And so what you see here is that every dot here is about 10 kids. And if I look at this class 8, if I look at this line here, you'll see how staggering the variation is within the classroom. Okay, so I have children at a 2nd grade level, at a 3rd grade, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, all sitting in the same classroom. Okay, so, and you can just see how this is humanly impossible for a teacher to deal with. It doesn't matter how motivated I am, how qualified I am. It is physically impossible for me to teach in a way that spans that level of learning levels within a given classroom. Okay, and so, and once you see this picture, you kind of then all of the other facts I showed you start making sense, right? Because there's this. And so if you look at the journey of research that led to the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019, right, which was, won by my advisors and mentors and the JPAL founders. So, Michael Kramer, my direct advisor, some of his studies were very, very, very simple, right? Just saying what happens if you give free textbooks to children in Kenya. Okay. So because you go to these schools, you see children don't have books. And the first thing you think about is I need to get them books. Okay. But what he found is that simple study, free textbooks, but zero impact on learning outcomes. Okay, so now it doesn't make sense. But then what they looked at was they looked at the data and found that the children in the top 20% of the baseline scoring distribution actually did benefit from the textbook. Okay, but the average child did not benefit because the average child could not read. So basically, the problem, a lot of the kind of reason well-intentioned policies don't work is that those who are in elite policy-making circles don't even imagine the constraints, and you project it's unimaginable to us that the book will not help because we all read, right? How can a book not help? But the book is not going to help if you can't read. Okay. So, and this may help explain why so many of our interventions don't seem to have an impact, because we are not alleviating the binding constraint. And the binding constraint here is that if you fall behind before kind of, third or fourth class, it's almost too late. So, and which is why the focus on foundational literacy numeracy is something that we've been hammering on for a long time. So, but this picture will give you a sense of why so much of our business as usual spending is not translating into outcomes. And before this becomes a lecture as opposed to a conversation, I will stop there, right? And then let you come back with, thoughts on this. But, we can talk more about policy and additional implications. But I think this picture is really, really important for people to see it in their minds. So then let me just say one more thing, okay, which then connects to the title of the lecture, the title of the talk itself, okay, which is, when I present this picture, whether it's in the US or even in India, people often can't make sense of this, right? So in the US, people will say, I thought India had one of the best education systems in the world, right? You guys, you produce the CEO of Google, the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of IBM, like wherever you go, you have Indians kind of, at the top of whatever they're doing. And how do you make sense between that enormous success on one side, right? And the fact that 60% of our children can't read. And I think this is where it's useful to take a step back and think about, historically, there were three very distinct purposes of education systems, okay? And these three purposes often have very conflicting pressures in terms of what you do, okay? So there is the classic understanding of education as providing human development and skills, okay? Which is, am I teaching you things that allows you to just be more skilled and be able to do more stuff? So that's what I call the human development function of education. But there has also been a completely different function, which is the sorting and screening and selection function, right? Which is, we have, as a society, we have used education as a way of identifying who is smart and then channeling those children and students to positions of higher education and leadership in our society, right? So, and this is not just India. This has been true in almost every system, whether it's China or East Asia, that you have these high stakes exams to identify who is your talent, okay, and then to channel that accordingly. And then there has been a third historical purpose of education systems, which has nothing to do with learning skills, but it has everything to do with forming preferences and forming identity, right? Which is, so as economists, we think about the choices people make after your preferences are formed, right? We take your preferences as given, and if you're a marketing professor, you'll say, okay, given these consumer tastes, how are they going to choose between different goods? But we don't ask, where do the preferences come from, right? Whereas education, the reason education has always been so political is because the formation of preferences happens in the schooling system, right? So whether it's kind of debates over the content of the curricula or debates over, separation of church and state. So, those are the things. So in fact, historically, my colleague Agustina Paglian at UCSD has a recent paper in the American Political Science Review, and she shows that a lot of the historical formation of mass education systems actually had very little to do with learning and skills, but more to do with rulers wanting to create a certain kind of shared civic identity. So, the French education system was about how do you build a Frenchman. So the point is that these three purposes of education systems are often in conflict, right? So if you care primarily about identity formation, then as an education, establishment, you focus on the content of textbooks, and that's kind of what is important. If you're focused on kind of sorting and selection, then you're running a system basically focused on these exams, okay? Do I have the integrity of the exams? So one way to make sense of the Indian education system is that fundamentally we function like a sorting and selection system, right? So if I look at the successes of the Indian diaspora in particular. So Devesh Kapoor and co-authors have this lovely book called The Other 1%, right? Where they essentially say that the reason for the success of the Indian community in the US is a positive selection story, right? So if you kind of look at who goes into the IIT, it's if you select the top 0.01% of a billion-person distribution, right? Those children are going to do fantastic things regardless of whether you've taught them anything. That's because you have identified the smart ones, okay? So, and even today, the entire system obsesses about that exam and the ranking as opposed to learning, right? And so therefore, coming to the title of the talk is that the way the Indian education system has functioned is essentially is a selection system that says, how do I identify the top 10% or top 1%? And, these are then the folks who will go on to positions of leadership and responsibility. Whereas what we need is to move into a human development paradigm that says, doesn't matter where you are today. My goal as an education system is to make you better tomorrow than what you were today, right? How do I take you wherever you are in the distribution and try to make sure that you have more skills? And it sounds very simple, but this is an incredibly hard problem. And the reason it's so hard is that the tail that wags the dog of our education system is the exam structure, right? And because the exam is kind of set at a high standard, if a child is way below, essentially what becomes the dominant strategy is to cram every past exam for the past 10 years and to hope that somehow you will be able to pass this exam. And, whether you understand any concepts or not, we don't care. Okay. So I think let me stop there because I've said a lot at a lot of speed, but I want to cover some of the core content and the research, right, that underlies some of these points. And then we can have, a more extended discussion.
I think at least I am reeling with how much you've said in these last few minutes, and trying to absorb that, and I'm sure our audience too. Before getting into this webinar, I knew that I would not really have to do very much. Having heard you speak on these subjects so authoritatively in so many forums, I knew that it is best I get out of the way and let you flow. So don't feel obliged after the next question to stop. Just go on. We are mesmerized by the depth of thinking you're bringing to this topic. But just one or two comments on what you've said. One is true that all that has been good and all that keeps the government and everyone keeps talking about are so many new schools built, so many kilometers of school boundaries built, so many new teachers hired, so much extra percentage of GDP spent on education, or the percentage of student enrollment, are all inputs. They are not outcomes. But that's not unique to education. In every sector that I have worked in, you measure inputs because inputs are easier to measure. They are quantifiable. I can count school buildings. I can count students. I can count teachers. I can measure boundary walls of schools. These are all very quantitative things. And in all lines of business that I have been in, we jokingly say in business, as I'm sure you say, that we count what can be counted, not what counts. And we count because it's easy to count spending, easy to count number of teachers and number of students and so on. And outcomes, in spite of all your research, is still a nebulous concept. What is learning outcome is a nebulous concept and not easy to count. That's one. And the second is input is quick to count and show and wave a flag. And for most bureaucrats and policymakers, secretaries in the departments of education and education ministers, they have limited shelf life. They are in their role for 2, 3, 4, 5 years maximum. So they can tout their inputs very quickly. Oh, I built 1,000 new schools in my schools. I increased enrollment from 70% to 80%. They cannot tout outcomes because outcomes take a generation. Outcomes don't happen in 2, 3 in the lifetime of a secretary of education. So it's a kind of a catch-22, and not just in education, in every line of business. We keep talking inputs because inputs are easy to count, not they can be counted, not that they count. So how do you get out of that loop?
Yeah, so I think you've I think beautifully articulated what the structural challenge is, right? I mean, so it is not like our education ministers and education secretaries who don't care about learning outcomes, right? They would very much like to get learning outcomes. It is just for the deep structural reasons that you mentioned and it's not just the fact that outcomes are hard to measure, right? The truth is the outcomes often take many years to achieve, right? So, and particularly for something like education, where, the school is only one part of this. It also depends on your other inputs. Okay. So I think, but going back to what you said about the private sector, see, the big difference is that, see, as an economist, I don't worry about how a Maruti or a Tata Nano, like how do they produce their cars? Okay. Why? Because at some level, you're facing market prices for your factors and inputs. At another level, you're facing market prices and competition for what you sell. Okay. So if you're not efficient, there is a market test that is giving you feedback in a real-time way that something we're doing is not working, okay? Whereas the problem in the public sector is that you can spend other people's money badly for a very, very, very long time because there is no market test, right? And what determines your budget is much more your kind of ability to lobby and ability to argue rather than any market test of the effectiveness of your expenditure, okay? So which is why this is a really wicked problem, okay? And there is no easy solution. Now, the one thing which I would do, and as you know probably from the podcast, is like, I've been working on my first book after all these years of writing papers, right? And I am and books take about 3 years, and I'm about 95% of the way done with the first full draft, but now, it'll still take another 6 months to simplify. But this book is called Fixing the Indian State, okay? So it's a book on state capacity and how do we, and I think this crisis of state capacity we are seeing in the context of COVID more viscerally, right? I mean, than even before, because I think it's a bit of a tangent, but I think one of the reasons we've allowed our state capacity to atrophy so much in the past 30 years is that we've had complete elite exit, right, from being recipients of public services. Okay, so the elites and policy making classes pretty much completely go to private schools, private health, private security, right? I mean, and the only thing you can't totally privatize is the air that you breathe, but even there, you'll try to. But what we've seen in COVID is, and sometimes. One of the analogies I give is that it's like if the elites and the middle classes are like flying first in business class in the plane that is India. Okay, so you've kind of insulated yourself from the day-to-day kind of troubles. But when the plane is crashing, it's going to take everybody down with it. Okay, and that's kind of, I think, where we are right now, where the state failure and state collapse, as you see in many parts of the country, that we can't get our most basic functions done. Okay, so my hope is that this is a moment of national kind of reflection, and as we approach 75 years of independence, we really kind of take seriously this mission of rebuilding the core capacities of the state. Okay, and now, but one of the ways you build that core capacity is by better statistical systems, which we have also allowed to atrophy since that initial investment that happened at the time of independence. Okay, and so one of the things that I have a whole chapter on outcome measurement, right? Which is the advances in technology have now made it possible for us to do high quality measurement of outcomes in representative samples in a way that allows us to generate annual district level estimates of core development outcomes, right? So what is happening to nutrition? What is happening to learning outcomes? What is happening to, you can take some of our core SDG goals and saying this can happen at a district level. Now, what happens is once you have that outcome data, what I would like to see changing in government is today the culture of a review meeting. When a principal secretary takes a review meeting with district collectors or district officers, right? It is, okay, let's look at the scheme implementation and how has the scheme been implemented. And that's because even somebody who cares about outcomes has no outcome data to work with, right? So there are very, very well-meaning principal secretaries I've interacted with who will tell me that we are flying blind, right? Because we just have no idea in terms of outcomes. And so we do the inputs because, like you said, that's what we can measure, right? So if you want to kind of move the kind of focus of governance to think a little bit more about outcomes, you have to start with better measurement. Now, of course, you can't measure everything that matters, and then we can have long debates on what should be measured, how should be measured, sampling, frequency, representativeness. But I think what is being forgotten is that we have such dramatic improvements in measurement technology over the past 20 odd years that we now have the capacity to measure way more, right? I mean, than before. And again, you guys are all in business schools. So, you know that if you look at the long arc of human progress, it is that better measurement is the foundation of better productivity, right? Going back to the original days of management consulting, it used to be ADL in factory floors in the 1920s, literally measuring productivity, right? On every part of the shop floor and saying, how do you improve these processes at a micro level? So the entire field of modern management, right? Grew from better measurement of productivity. So the clock, so David Landis, the famous economic historian at Harvard, right, has an entire book on the clock and how the clock, and there's other, histories of modern kind of science and technology that will talk about how clock was the single most important innovation in terms of boosting productivity. So similarly, I'll give you another example, right? So there's this lovely QJE paper by Baker and Hubbard showing how once you had GPS devices on trucks, right, how this dramatically improved the productivity of trucking fleets because you could now just track where every piece of your, of your trucking fleet is, right? So there is the private sector today whether it's an Amazon or logistics kind of companies, have such incredible investments in measurement because they understand that measurement is the foundation of better productivity. So of course you will constantly refine what you measure, and there's all kinds of problems with measurement, but there is no question in my mind that the way we start addressing some of these structural issues you're talking about is by kind of reinvesting in measurement in a systematic way that then allows the system to say, okay, yes, inputs is what is in my control, but am I achieving the outcomes, and at least have a faster feedback loop between kind of, your inputs and your outcomes. So hopefully that helps address some of that, but it's a long journey. I mean, I think, it's a hard problem, but I do feel that we know what needs to be done and kind of just need to get our act together and start doing it.
Great. Okay. One other quick observation, which I think also comes from somewhere in some of your reading and talks that I have been listening to and reading, the case of unintended consequences, which happens in every line when you try to do something in good faith and for goodness of your heart, some unintended consequences happen. One of the things I believe you have researched or talked about is this massive growth in student enrollment over the last 2 to 3 decades has meant that a large number of school students today are first-time school goers in their family or in their extended family or in their village. So a large part of education, as we all know who have raised kids, is support for education at home, helping your child do homework and teaching child at home and not just relying on the few hours in school. But because a large number of new school entrants have come into the system who do not have educated family members back home, that loop breaks down. So the moment the child goes home, they are in a different world. No one knows what they're talking about and no one can support them. Is that has been a constraint, and are we getting over that now that a generation has gone through it?
No, so absolutely, right? I think that is almost certainly a first order constraint. And again, in terms of what you do about this, so as a society, we need to make these additional investments in the early years. Okay. And so I have this new paper that will be it'll be out as an NBR working paper on Monday. And this is again based on a large-scale randomized control trial in Tamil Nadu, where across 320 Anganwadi centers in 4 districts, we studied the effect of something very, very simple of so today, I think Rukmini Banerjee of Pratham, she describes Anganwadi workers as kind of goddess Durga of our system, right? Because we expect this one poor worker to handle health, nutrition, preschool education, and a ton of administrative work, right? So again, if you go to the field, coming back to dirty shoes and do like a time, now of course, as I get more senior, it's my field teams that are doing that, but I'm still reviewing the data, right? As we do this as a PhD student, I would be in the field myself, but what you see in the time use data, okay, is that almost 25% of their time goes literally in filling 14 different registers that they're expected to maintain. Okay, so what we saw is that even though on paper they're supposed to do all of these things, in practice, the average preschool even in Tamil Nadu, right, which is one of the better functioning states in terms of basic service delivery, right, that even in Tamil Nadu, the average child was getting only about 38 minutes a day of preschool instruction. This is in the age group 3 to 5. Okay, so what we did was we just studied the effect of hiring an extra early childhood education facilitator. Okay. And these are incredibly cost-effective investments, right? Because you're paying the Anganwadi workers in general are paid much lower salaries because they're hired from the local community as opposed to hired through a government civil service exam, which then makes them, transferable and have a higher government pay. But, the stipend was just 4,000 rupees a month. Okay. So for 4,000 rupees a month, you were able to, and what's important, and I'll come back to scalability of this, right? For 4,000 rupees a month, you got an extra early childhood education facilitator working half shift, about 4 hours. Okay. And so her main task was in the time from 10 to 12, which is scheduled for preschool instruction, that she would just do preschool instruction. Okay. And so what we found was just that simple thing ended up doubling the time spent on preschool instruction. And we get a very, very large increase in kind of foundational math and literacy skills and executive function in the age group of 3 to 5. But the really big bonus from this intervention, which even, we had we said we would study nutrition as a second outcome, but we were pleasantly surprised to see the results, which is that because it was also freeing up the time of the existing Anganwadi worker to focus a little bit more on health and nutrition related activities, what we found was also a significant reduction in child malnutrition. Okay, so, and we estimate that if you do a cost benefit calculation now, again, this is where, the research, we have to make more assumptions because we don't have really long-term studies in India that are linking early childhood investments to later life outcomes. Okay, but we have some excellent studies from other parts of the world that have done 40-year longitudinal follow-ups of kind of, children with early age interventions, and that they find very substantial long-term impacts in terms of both levels of, in school attainment, labor market outcomes. So if you use some of those estimates to then calculate what is a present discounted value of a similar investment in the Indian setting, we, at least in Tamil Nadu, which is where we did the study, we estimate that the kind of the ROI on that is about 16 to 20 times the cost. Okay, and in fact, if you do this, what happens is that even if you recover 6.5% of this extra income through GST, which you will, the public return on investment of this is actually infinite. Okay, and that's because you are recovering your cost completely and you're getting these big returns. Okay, now this should not be blindly interpreted to say that we should therefore spend on everything, because what you see is that the accountability and governance of the personnel also matters enormously, and that's when you hire a local staff at the village. So I have a whole chapter in the book on personnel management in the public sector, right? But when you hire a local staff member, right, that they are much more connected to the community, so the absence rates are much lower and the pay is much lower compared to, like, what you pay a government employee, right? So in a world of scarce fiscal resources, it's not just enough to say, let me spend more on education, right? And why you need the evidence is to say, in an education budget, there are 25 different things I can do, correct? So, but in a world of scarce resources, it is absolutely imperative that we identify the cost effectiveness of each of these things and kind of put cost effectiveness almost at the center of how we see. Most of our policy debates focus on what is the sectoral allocation, right? But once the sectoral allocation is done, we have very little visibility on how the money is being spent in the sector and what is the effectiveness of that, correct? So, but if I was to say there is one huge message from 20 years of, say, RCTs done by, me and several others in education, it's that even in the same sector, there is so much variation in the cost effectiveness of what you do, that if you move money from less cost effective to more cost effective interventions in the same sector, you're going to be able to deliver much, much more with that same budget. Okay, so coming back to where you started in terms of these early learning gaps, I would say today that strengthening the Anganwadi system by putting an extra worker in these systems, like focused exclusively on pre-school education, putting extra attention on first generation learners, right, who are the ones who are more likely to come to the Anganwadis in the first place, and perhaps even augmenting teaching staff, like, with teaching assistants in class 1, class 2, so that every child who completes class 2 is foundationally literate and numerate. If we can achieve that one thing as a country, like, that would be more than we've done in 75 years, right? And so, and again, I didn't show you the other graph, but what we have is this longitudinal tracking of learning outcomes, where you see that after class 2 or class 3, for the children who haven't learned the basics by then your learning trajectory flattens out. It's because, you need to be able, till class 1 and 2, you are being taught to read, but after that you need to be able to read to learn. So if you can't read by then, your education is very severely hampered at that point, right? So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, very much. Okay, so since we are kind of running out of time, and I can warn you right now that we might hold you beyond 8 p.m. our time, with because the number of questions that are popping up in the chat, as you might be seeing, is huge, and we will need to do justice to those. But before we get to that, uh, uh, one kind of elephant in the room we haven't talked about is NEP, the new National Education Policy of 2020. So, so does that fix all of this? We are all good to go now?
No, like, so I think, as with everything in India, right, like, there's good news and bad news. Okay, so the good news is that overall, I consider the NEP a relatively, it's a more sensible education policy document than ones we've had in the past. Okay, I think the ones we've had in the past have been very well intentioned, and I'll specifically call out RTE, right, where RTE, I think, in many ways set us back, right? It set us back by having a bunch of, I would say, idealistic notions that the system had absolutely no capacity to implement. Okay, so and that's then the data kind of bears that out. Now, I think what the RTE does well. So overall, I think the process was excellent. I think the committee did very, very extensive set of consultations. They got written inputs from a whole range of people. And again, I put in a set of inputs, as did others. And I think they have gotten the basics right. Okay, they've gotten the basics right in terms of the focus on foundational literacy and numeracy, right? We can talk a little bit about higher education. So I think as a policy document overall, I think it's a good document, right? The problem in India has, of course, never been the policy document, right? The problem is that the policy documents often bear no resemblance to what happens in practice. Okay, now, and this is not the fault of the NEP, because the NEP is not meant to be an implementation document, right? A policy document by construction sets a set of priorities and goals that can guide what would then become the implementation plans. Okay, so I think essentially on NEP, I would say that it sets us potentially in the right direction, but in practice, I don't have visibility yet on how this is going to translate into action. And in particular, and maybe we can discuss this as a separate question, is I am just petrified about what is happening to our education system in light of COVID, right? And I think the COVID shock to education, if I was to kind of put a marker today, right, I would say that 10 years down the line, when we go back and look at the historical consequences of the COVID crisis, that it will not be the oxygen cylinders and the unnecessary deaths much as those are visceral. It will be how we have permanently set back, I would say, 10 million children a year in terms of not paying attention to what's going on in the school education system. Okay, so and I think the term K-shaped recovery has been used widely about what's going on in a post-COVID economy, and this is obviously true at the level of an economy, but I think it's even more true at the level of education. Okay, so we have managed to retreat into a bubble of online education, and where so this is very, very nice paper by Jishnu Das and co-authors that looked at this earthquake in Pakistan in 2005, where they were kind of collecting a bunch of data. So you had this devastating earthquake that completely flattened, households in this entire area. Now, but what was very interesting about this earthquake is, unlike other natural disasters, the aid was kind of speedy. Okay, so it was very visible. So they got a lot of foreign aid to rebuild after the earthquake. Okay, so unlike most other disasters where the aid money gets siphoned away, this was a case where the aid came back and the houses got rebuilt. Okay, now what is really interesting is they went and surveyed these households 4 years after the earthquake. Okay, and what they found is that the quality of physical assets and infrastructure of the house had actually improved in the treated area. So if you got affected by the earthquake, you actually were doing better than the past, because the aid money was so much that you actually rebuilt your houses much better than the weaker houses that got beaten up by the earthquake. Okay, but what they find is on learning outcomes, the children, because they missed about 6 months of school, the children of educated mothers had pretty much caught up. So there was no kind of learning loss. But the children without educated mothers were permanently behind, even after missing school for just about 4 months. Okay. And so what that highlights is that much as we may say that the schooling system has not delivered, it is still way better than the counterfactual of nothing. Okay. And particularly for the first generation learners, and if you don't have educated mothers at home. So coming back to NEP, right? I mean, I think the foundational, the building blocks are there, at least in school education, but I have yet to see clarity with regard to how this is translating into implementation. And, and particularly, and this is a very, very difficult problem, right? It's not an easy, in fact, I have multiple times wanted to write op-eds about how we need to do a judicious school opening plan, but it is such a vexing problem, right? It's a vexing problem because there's no question that if you open schools, some of the infections will go up, correct? So, and you can see why no politician or secretary wants to take that chance. And the safest thing to do is to say, keep the schools closed. But the problem is that there is also an opportunity cost of that decision, right? That decision is not a costless decision in terms of the children who are not in school. So sometimes, like they say, in a situation of war, there's going to be casualties, whatever decision you take, right? I mean, and judicious decision making is about calibrating and calculating these risks and communicating to the public. So personally, I would like to see every school education department in the state right now, despite COVID, at least make plans for what would a prudent opening, at least say in rural areas, right? I mean, so can you have settings in villages where you can sit outside, be socially distanced, and have some basic instruction, and at least have that option available for children from first generation learners? So everybody's excited about technology, but we know from our data that at least 30, 40, 50% of the lower bottom end of the SES distribution, they're not accessing the WhatsApp messages. They're not accessing some of these tech-based instructions. So even in the best situation where tech can do stuff, I am 99% sure that the learning inequalities have increased dramatically in the past year. And I am not just seeing any policy attention to this issue at all. And which then, ironically, our response to COVID, I think, is magnifying the underlying point I said, right? Which is our education system is fundamentally a sorting and selection system and not an education system. Why? Because the only part of the education system that we are somehow trying to make function is the board exams, okay? Because it's almost like the secret is out. कि पढ़ाई तो अपने आप कर लोगे. Our job is to run the exams, okay? So it is that the government's focus is on how do I run the exam system, right? And not much on what is happening to actual education. And that is something that really, really worries me, right, about where we are right now.
Okay, since we are definitely running out of time on the NEP, one last thing which I think is of relevance to us and our audience and our Ahmedabad University community. For the first time, as far as I know, in education policy documents, there has been fair amount of mention of interdisciplinarity and a move towards getting away from vertical silo-based, subject-based, discipline-based education to more horizontal, broad-based education. Does that go far enough? Will we become like many countries that are talked about, Finland and many of those Scandinavian countries who somehow managed to do well on everything? Will we move towards that kind of problem-based and issue-based education rather than discipline-based siloed education based on this policy, you think?
So again, I think the policy document is a perfectly sensible aspirational document, right, about the directions in which we want to go. But what I have no visibility on is the capacity of the universities to actually implement that, right? I mean, so again, the tail that wags the dog is the exam system, right? So as long as your exams are kind of being set in a purely disciplinary way, right, for most students, that will be, the main thing you focus on. Now, I do think that most of our larger universities in the country have multiple departments. And so, creating a structure whereby you say that even if you're an engineering graduate, you need to have a certain amount of exposure to other disciplines, right? So that, that you're not just a narrowly trained technical person, but have some awareness of humanities, of, so what, or ethics and philosophy of what does one do with these skills, or some exposure to social sciences and, others. So I think, that's one. Again, as an aspirational goal, it is wonderful, but I don't have enough visibility on kind of the capacity, right, of the system right now to actually do that. Now, I think there are a few things I like a lot. So I think the idea of the National Research Foundation is a very good one, because I think the right way to promote research is to say that, because essentially research is done by faculty and not by universities, correct? But if you have a funding system for research that encourages faculty members to apply for competitive research grants that are well funded, and if as part of that funding formula, the university is getting, its overhead, which is how the National Science Foundation works, right? So then you are kind of, again, instead of just saying, I will give you money, because what you don't want to do, so there's obviously a certain element of saying that we will identify institutes of excellence and give them autonomy. So I think that makes sense. But there might be amazing researchers sitting in universities that are not otherwise well known, correct? So by having a more competitive research landscape that says, talent wherever it is in the country can apply for competitive funding, and that competitive funding has enough kind of support for the university, that universities then recognize, how to kind of value faculty who are producing good research, and therefore changing the incentive structures for how we are kind of run as universities. I think that would be so these are, I think, steps in the right direction. But, I'm starting my first major higher education research project, right now. So hopefully I'll have some data on this in a couple of years. But I prefer not to talk before I've done research on it, right? So, yeah.
Okay. We'll come back to you in a couple of years to talk about that again. I had promised in the beginning that we will cycle back to the latter part of your journey as So you became the dirty shoes economist, and you did a lot of fieldwork based research. But you then went on to having an impact on policy. You were involved in the 12th five-year plan under the mentorship of Monte Ahluwalia and others. As you just mentioned, your work has been cited into the NEP. So how, and for a lot of people in our audience who are researchers and academics and are attempting to impact policy, uh, just a couple of minutes or 5 minutes on how did you make that transition? Because researcher as academic is deep and longitudinal and takes time and data accuracy and data validity, while policy making is the art of the possible. You do what you do with incomplete data because you need to show some results today, not 5 years down the line, and so on. So it's very kind of uh, run with it, run with what you have rather than wait for the perfect data to be collected. And in that, again, quoting you back to yourself, you somewhere mentioned that policymakers like to listen to consultants because they come with shiny PowerPoints and impressive presentations. One of your quotes, which is stuck in my mind for many months now, is consultants have confidence, academics have confidence intervals. So so how did you make that jump, which I think many of our academic researchers would want to learn from, to not just being a good, solid, grounded researcher, but becoming a policymaker or at least an advisor to policymakers? Mhm.
And I think, so I have not, to be fair, I have not ever been inside government, right? So even my appointments are kind of as honorary advisor, right? So in that sense, my primary identity is very much as an academic and a researcher, right? So even today, when, I think the most important feature of an academic is I'm not afraid to say, I don't know. Okay. So if somebody is like, boss, I have not done the research, I don't have anything to tell you. Now, I can go back to first principles and saying, based on first principles, here are some pointers. But coming back to your question, see, I think some areas of research are just more naturally, I think, aligned with policy, right? So because I'm a public finance economist, public finance at its core is about how do you essentially run policy, right? I mean, because there's the taxation side, there is the expenditure side, and both of these at their heart are policy functions. Okay. So in that sense, I think the policy relevance of my work happens naturally in a way that, doesn't always happen for every research area. So I don't think every researcher should say, okay, I want to go work in policy. Now, but that being said, when you have a body of work, and coming to how I've done policy work, see, typically my view is that we should not do too much policy work based on just, say, an individual study, right? But once you have a body of evidence, so the way this is done, say, in the US or the UK is, you have scientific bodies, you have national academies, you have, essentially where you have bodies of eminent scientific experts in their respective disciplines who will try to synthesize and saying, based on all of this research and evidence, here's what we can do. Now, honestly, if you look at the mapping from fundamental research to policy, usually what the problem from kind of academics to policy is threefold, right? So one is the time horizon, right? That, when there's a policy window to do something, right? The policymaker wants an answer quickly. And, often the academic needs much more time. The second is just language, right? How do you even talk to each other, right? So the academic's language is necessarily couched, right? So there's the flip side of, when I say confidence intervals, of Truman saying, give me a one-handed economist. I don't want somebody says on the one hand, on the other hand, just tell me what to do, right? So which then creates the market for the consultants, right? The market for the certainty to say, here is the confidence, right? Go and do this. Okay. So I think in practice, the way I see the system work well when it does is, in the US, when it works well, is that more of the policy work is done by think tanks and not by individual academics, right? So the individual academics are in the business of producing peer-reviewed, high-quality research that stands the test of time. But a good think tank, okay, say a Brookings Institution or a Center for Global Development, a good think tank will have its own PhDs. But these are PhDs who are not necessarily producing new research, but these are PhDs who understand how to read research and understand how to assess the quality of evidence, and whose primary job is to synthesize rather than produce, right? And that is not to be looked down on, right? Because I think synthesis is an incredibly important skill. But effectively that's a slightly different skill set, okay, which is the think tank. And then there are what I would call ideally the policy economists themselves, right? So the role of a chief economic advisor in the government should not be to say, I have all the answers. The role of the CEA is really to have a Rolodex of all of the experts in an area, that when something comes up, because you see, the other missing market is actually just the matchmaking, right? So then there's a joint secretary who's working on a certain policy issue. He has no idea who are the academics who've done research on this. And similarly, the academics who are writing on something have, no way or even interest in knowing who is the personality occupying an office on a given day, right? So the role of a good government economist is to basically say that here is the policy question that's happening, and here is my mental kind of roster of the 20 experts, and then can I call them? So then I think, so for the academics who want to have kind of impact on policy, I think the right way to do this is to just, take the effort, okay, to get to know policymakers, not even IAS, right? Because the IAS guys get transferred all the time, right? I mean, it is in your area, right? I mean, who are, say, the technical advisors within government who kind of usually have a role of saying, okay, synthesize some evidence for me or research for me, so that then when the opportunity comes, that they know who to reach out to, right? So in my own case, it was just helped by the fact that because I had been presenting some of my work in very, high profile fora, like, so people like Dr. Aluwalia knew my work even as a PhD student, because we were the first people collecting nationwide data, right? I mean, on these metrics. And so the service delivery agenda, this was part of the World Development Report. So the WDR got presented to senior policymakers. So people became aware of my work relatively early, which then meant that when there was a policy window, they would reach out. Now, again, not everybody does this, right? So that planning commission had not only Monte Aluwalia as deputy chair, but also Dr. Narendra Jadhav, who was member education. And he had a PhD in economics. He was the former executive director of the RBI doing monetary policy. He was a former vice chancellor of Pune University. So, therefore, again, there's a little bit of a research temperament. And he said, oh, Karthik, please come and help us kind of get this thing right. And that's how I wrote the background paper to the 12th plan. So again, I think in my own case, it was a little serendipitous. And it's not like I made the transition to policy, but it's more like, because the research is motivated by policy, I spent 3 to 5 years doing the research and writing the peer-reviewed papers. But once that is out and peer-reviewed, then you say, okay, now let's create the policy syntheses. So for example, this Anganwadi paper, right, when I have a result, right, then at Niti Aayog, where I'm honorary advisor, we were scheduled to do a workshop like last week with all the state secretaries of women and child development. And, that forum exists now because I have invested in the system over the last 15 years, including going to the academy in Missouri and, teaching the senior IS officers in phase 4 and phase 5. So that way there is a certain kind of, the policymaker also understands that I understand the practical constraints. But yeah, so that was my own journey. But I think most people, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about how do you make those connections. But I think the connection doesn't happen by saying, I want to do policy. It kind of happens much more organically by saying, I'm doing the research and I'm building the networks so that when there is a policy window for the research, you're able to have an impact.
Okay. Yeah. So we will need to get to others who have been listening to just you and me. So let's bring some other people in. Before that, to begin with, I think most importantly, since we've spent the last hour and more on school education, we have our Vice Chancellor here, Professor Pankaj Chandra, who you know very well, Karthik. So if possible, can we get Professor Chandra to bring in, either ask you any questions if he has, Pankaj, or any kind of pivot from there to higher education from what Karthik has been saying. Does that ring true for higher education? Because you are kind of one of the foremost thinkers and practitioners of higher education. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Ravi. Well, thanks, Karthik. What a fabulous talk and conversation, and especially the insights that you, and I'm not surprised, but the insights that you brought onto the table, and each one of them, I think, I hope in due course of time, people who will implement much of this policy should listen to you. No, I don't have much, but I want to make one comment, and that is, actually, I was very disappointed with NEP. Mm-hmm. Because as a student of management, I don't see policy as just good statement. of intent. I think a policy has to have implementation built into it. And this is kind of where NEP really did enormous disservice to a thinking which is so fabulous. I think there's nothing that you can quarrel with in NEP. But knowing the state leaders, both the politicians as well as the bureaucrats who are going to implement this, I have a feeling it's doomed. Because that thinking does not rest with these folks within the states, the state secretaries or the Department of Education people and others, because they see implementation in terms of very cut and dry 5 steps. But what you talked about are processes. Improvement in education, which takes so much of time, is all about processes, putting the right process in place rather than having a statement. So that disappoints me very much. And having been on a few committees that got put together on implementation, I'm actually seeing that happen. It's a very cut and dry. Oh, okay. So interdisciplinarity means 10% of every curriculum ought to be of this nature. But I think it just won't work as we go along, and we'll really make a hash of a great thinking that got put together in the form of NEP. So that's my quarrel with people who put it together. But I have just one a comment or two of them. One, I think, is about investments as well. I think India has underinvested phenomenally. Of course, it's all about, as you said, effectiveness of investment in my mind is very crucial too, as you rightly raised. But we have not invested enough. And until unless we do that over a period of time, I think, or some way the society puts money into education, it's going to be very challenging for us to be able to do many things. And that's one. The second elephant in the room is really education, and especially at the school level. Unless we make schools autonomous in terms of their ability to be able to craft their own ways of implementing very good ideas, it'll be very challenging to be able to, it'll be fine. I think your idea of early education probably will be able to execute, but many things in NEP we will not be able to do. Because at the end, they'll all scramble to write the CBSE class 10th exam with 20 lakh students, where the only thing that will happen is people will have to just write standardized questions and standardized answers, and whoever does the highlighting of the right word gets the mark, another guy doesn't. So I think somewhere that part has to be broken up. And there is a possibility. It'll be very difficult for many to accept it, but the possibility is to not have those class 10th and 12th exams. Give schools that ability to actually test their students. Now, the fear is, oh my God, everybody is going to give 99% to their schools. But then, that's where a statewide test at class 3, class 6, class 9th, and class 11th can be put in place to actually rank the schools and not the student. So as soon as I know that I've been giving 99% of marks to all my kids, but I'm ranked 200 out of 210 schools in my state, then I know something is dramatically wrong, and people can intervene. Because teaching and learning requires enormous amount of very differential engagement rather than very standardized teaching and learning processes. Because the kids are very different. India is many Indias, and so I think somewhere these one or two things need to be broken before we can, at a systems level, be able to make the kind of movement. And it's as much true for higher education as it is for school education.
Yeah, so I think, so I agree. So on the implementation side, I tend to be and maybe irrational optimist, right? So at least I give them credit for the quality of the document. But this article I wrote for Science, we clearly talk about how implementation is where 95% of the attention is needed. So I think we're fully agreed on that. I think the challenge with the exam system, and which is why even before going to the solution, I was focusing on the first principles about what creates this tension, right? The tension comes from the fact that we are trying to do two completely different things. So the human development function, which is what you as an educator want to focus on, is very different from the sorting function, right? Which is what the exam system is designed to do. And so now the unfortunate thing is that getting rid of the exams does not by itself solve the problem. And the reason is that the system, the economy is still going to be demanding sorting of some sort, because you still have limited positions in higher education. So tomorrow when you're doing admissions to Ahmedabad University, and if you have to read 1 lakh applications in person, even you will need some standardized metric, something, because otherwise it just becomes kind of intractable, right? So which is why I wrote this other piece in this volume edited by Abhijit Banerjee and Raghuram Rajan on kind of, school education policy. And one of the pieces I talk about, which I don't think the NEP has done enough on, is exam reform, so that you have modular tests that can speak to absolute competence as opposed to relative, right? So that way, if you take away the ranking obsession, because the problem with ranking is by definition, it is a zero-sum game, right? Because the average is always the same. There's only one first. So there is some value in the pressure it creates, okay, because there is certainly some value that it kind of pushes you to excel and stuff like that. But for the vast majority at a systemic level, it's really a waste, because it is obsessing on a zero-sum game. Whereas if we can kind of have an assessment framework that focuses on absolute competence, that allows you to make your competition with yourself, right? Saying, do I know something that I did not know before? And that's what it will take to get us into this human development paradigm of education, as opposed to this sorting and selection. So, and I think that is where the fundamental schizophrenia lies, right? Because when you discuss the exam system, it is the tail that wags the dog. But understanding that these two different functions of education require two very different approaches. That the human development function will need more of what you say, but it is being hampered by the structure of the sorting and selection system we have. So it's a very hard problem. And, perhaps one silver lining, and again, is my book in many ways is addressed to states and chief ministers, because I really do believe that school education in particular is something that we need more state level experimentation on, because, it's just very, very hard in the defense of the NEP writers. If I was on the committee, I would also be very hesitant to kind of prescribe implementation roadmaps for the whole country, given that the capacity in a Kerala or Tamil Nadu is so different. Now, I think you could still do a little bit more, but these implementation plans have to be done at the minimum at a state level, if not further below that.
Thank you. Thanks, Pankaj. Thanks, Karthik, for your response to that. I'm
happy to go 15 minutes over,
so 15 minutes beyond. For many of our audience in India, you might be running into dinner time, so you'll need to make a choice between food or food for thought. So you choose if you need to go. And of course, Karthik, we woke you up at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning. 5:30. So sorry if you've not had breakfast, but we'll keep you for another few minutes. There is a flurry of questions in the chat. So what I'll do is call on one or two people to come on camera and ask their questions. And in that time, Karthik, if you want to scroll through the questions, if any question tickles your fancy, we can pick on those. We won't be able to answer all. I've been seeing some very interesting comments and questions from a couple of people. So let's see. The Parth Sarvate, are you there? And would you want to come on camera and ask your questions?
Hi, Karthik.
Very good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you, and wonderful presentation as usual. I'm very happy to hear you speak through the years about education reform. I had a simple question. I really loved your idea that we should put in an additional assistant teacher till grade 2 to make sure that all students get to the basic learning capacity that we need to at grade 2. And I think that's a fantastic suggestion. Now, what I wanted to know, are there any studies that are happening on this? Are there any pilots that are happening? And how does it go from a pilot to a scale level? And what is the, what would be a recommendation to governments be on how they can scale it? Because really the challenge lies in scaling. It's not being able to prove it in a few schools.
Yeah. So I have a very, very detailed answer to this. And so, it'll take me 3-5 minutes, but, bear with me, because if tomorrow I was an education minister in a state, this is the one thing I would do, right? I mean, so I think, so the answer to your question is we actually have a lot of evidence, right? So in a way you can think about the Anganwadi study we've just done as kind of contributing to that. And then I had done this earlier contract teacher RCT in Andhra Pradesh, where we put exactly this extra Vidya volunteer in the primary schools. And what you saw was that the greatest benefits were in fact the youngest classes, in class 1 and class 2. Okay. Now, so we already have the evidence that this works. Now, but here is the key point. Okay. The key point is there is this very big ideological fight, right? I mean, of the regular teachers versus the contract teachers, right? I mean, so now the problem is when you try to reduce class size with the regular teachers at 30 to 40,000 rupees a month, you just don't have the money to scale, right? I mean, and so now, but whereas the Anganwadi, this assistant who I talked about, right? I mean, who's hired at the village, was hired at 4,000 rupees, right? And, you could get a teaching assistant even at more qualified at about 6,000 to 8,000 rupees, and they would add a lot of value. Okay. Now, so the problem to scale is the fact that the idea of para teachers or contract teachers has been tried, but then became kind of got caught in three kinds of troubles. Okay. So what happened in Madhya Pradesh, say with this education guarantee scheme, was they were trying to do exactly this, saying, let's get a locally hired Guruji with 10th standard pass or 12th pass who can kind of run a local school, which was kind of a precursor to this. Now, the problem with contract teachers is it failed for three reasons. It failed for both kind of ideational reasons, because the education establishment hated the idea that you could have untrained teachers, right? So whether it's your NIPA or NCRT, everybody was like, this is simply unacceptable. We need trained teachers. Okay. Then there was a second problem, a legal problem of equal pay for equal work, that once you had enough of these teachers, they would go to the courts and saying, that this is unfair. And courts every once in a while would come and require governments to regularize them. And the third was the political problem, and particularly say in MP or even in Bihar, where if what happened was, the unfortunate thing was that the finance department started liking contract teachers as a way of cutting their salary bills. Okay. So then they would stop hiring regular teachers for many years. And then you're building up this pressure cooker of cohort after cohort of these contract teachers who have not been regularized. And then before an election, there will be this huge pressure and politicians will give in and they'll get regularized. And then what you saw in Madhya Pradesh was the worst of both worlds, which is that you got the benefits in the time of the contract teacher, but then they all got regularized. So now what has happened is education in Madhya Pradesh has deteriorated so much. In 2003, when I was there, when we were doing our absence work in 2003, it had among the lowest teacher absence rate at about 15%. And that, in my mind, was a big part driven by the local teachers, right? I mean, who's connected to the community. By 2010, that had gone up to 26%. And in 2016, when Abhijit and I did our recent paper in Madhya Pradesh, it is now at 35% is the measured teacher absence. Okay. So you've got the worst of both worlds, because you've regularized people who are also unqualified. Okay. So my kind of approach to fix this, and I've thought through this very, very, very carefully, right, is to say what I would like to do is to build an entire new structure of teacher training, okay, that is apprenticeship based and practicum based, okay, and so that also addresses this early problem I talked about on teacher training. See, it's not I don't believe in teacher training. I'm an educator, right? I believe in training. It would be kind of very schizophrenic if at some level I thought training did not matter, okay, but the point is you have to do training right, and for teaching, a big part of the training has to be practical experience, okay. So the way I would like to take we have the research insights that having locally hired additional staff in the schools is incredibly helpful. Okay. But how do you take that insight and thread it through these ideational, legal, and political challenges? Okay. And so my idea is that if you create, say, a 4-year practicum based teacher training program that children, or, sorry, not children, the children, the students, that candidates can apply to after 12th standard. Okay. And what you say is, let's say in every district, okay, the diet is the place where you run the program. You admit the top candidate from every panchayat every year. So it becomes a prestigious program that the government pays for. Okay. So it's not like one of these kind of degree mills that are charging money for a teacher training credential. Okay. Now, but if you do this, the idea would be, it is not that you reduce the training, but you modularize the training into theory and practice. Okay, you say every 3 months in the summer vacation, you kind of complete your theory course module, and then you spend 9 months back in the school in your own gram panchayat, like I mean, as a teaching assistant, where you are focused on small group instruction for class 1 and 2 students. Okay, but at the end of 4, and you're paid a stipend as well. Okay, you're paid a stipend. So at the end of 4 years, you have a teacher training credential. Okay, which is now going to be a better quality credential because of the practicum. Okay, and you don't have the judicial problem because it is by construction part of your, it is a practicum based component of your training. It is not that I'm permanently keeping you in this limbo of being like, a second class citizen in the school system. It is time bound, right? Within 3 years or 4 years of saying, here's the training program. And then what the other important thing I would like to do is, it's not like you freeze regular teacher hiring. You continue your regular teacher hiring. But at the time of regular teacher hiring, you give extra points to people who have come through this practicum training system, and you give extra points for every year spent in practice. And why is this such a good idea? Is because one of the reasons our public systems are so dysfunctional today, and again, this is in the book, is that because the government job lottery is something that if you are essentially a college educated youngster in India today, your holy grail is, how do I get a government job? Okay, and so which means that you write every possible government exam that you can possibly write, and jahan lag gayi wahan aap bharti ho gaye, right? Like, I mean, whether you have any interest in that field or no, you have won the government job lottery. Okay, so I have talked to, there are very motivated teachers, but there are just as many teachers who have absolutely no interest in this, but just this was another of the government exams that they wrote. Okay, so if your structure for regular recruitment then starts prioritizing people who have gone through a practicum based program, then you are showing a certain amount of commitment to the sector. Okay, so this would be how I would take this idea of a teaching assistant and embedded it, right, I mean, in a larger structure of practicum based teacher training. Now, what has happened is, based on some of these inputs, they have changed the B.Ed requirements to require practicum. Okay, but again, we've gone and observed this in practice. And what it ends up happening is, these B.Ed students will go to the nearest school that is most convenient to the college and just sit there and kind of do, acha, we have done some practical, we have done some observation, we have taken some diarying and journaling. But they are not actually being used to teach in that time. Right. So my point is that you could use the practicum period and make them the assistant instructors working under the supervision of the regular teacher, but with a focus on providing the supplemental instruction to class 1 and 2. Okay. So again, so the problem is, when you ask me a question, I will give you like a full extended answer, but hopefully that does kind of address the question that you raised.
Thanks. Thanks, Parth. Thanks, Karthik. Just a quick aside before we take on maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Karthik, you mentioned your paper in science, and to the audience, the mailer that came to you with the link for joining the webinar has the link to that paper in science. So please do read that if you haven't. And also, that mailer has a link to this famous podcast that we keep referring to, the Seen and the Unseen podcast, where Karthik has talked over 3.5 hours on this topic. So today was very rushed, and we could not obviously cover all that. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, the Seen and the Unseen, which is a series run by Amit Verma, the link to that podcast is also in the email that went to you with the link for this webinar. So go to those 2 resources. There's a lot more there. Having said that, I noticed that Anuradha Rai, you've been posting some really interesting comments and questions. Would you be able to come on camera and ask some of those questions to Karthik? Anuradha?
Sure. Thank you so much. Actually, I am not able to put on my video because it says the host doesn't allow. But yeah, Karthik, I've heard your podcast and read all your papers, and I think a lot of learnings, and I think the way forward would be, like, I'm pretty excited, and the way forward would be what you said about having those Anganwadi workers, but one-off trainings never work.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be like an ongoing process, like what I said. So we have to think of a model, where, they meet regularly, like a community of practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
And it is in context. So you see, one part is that, you acquire that knowledge and then you kind of adapt it. But what we need is automaticity, like in the classroom situation. I don't have time to think, okay, what should I do? it just happens spontaneously. So the training has to be such that the teachers are able, because it's a very complex school system, a classroom of 35 or 40, each one having a different need. And, it's very different. I'm a teacher at heart, so right now I'm heading a school, and I also am part of initiative where I do capacity building of teachers, using an innovative model. So I feel very strongly that it has to be an ongoing process. Only then will we be able to do it, and it is doable. Like whatever the national education policy as a vision document is a good document, and if we all put our heads together, like I'm a optimist and I feel we can do it. Like this is my kind of a thing, that if we have 1,000 hubs and training, or and say maybe over the next 2 years, it is doable. If Pratham is doing teach at the right level. So if we kind of really have people kind of sitting and deciding on this, designing this, like I already have it in my head, and I think it is doable. Whatever, so it might take time, but it is possible. That's what I feel. And thank you so much. I'm very excited.
Thank you. I agree with everything. Let me just add a couple of things, So one, yes. So I think part of the problem with training today is, see, on paper, again, we have every teacher is supposed to get 20 days a year of in-service training, right? But in practice, we know that barely happens. And even if it happens, the quality is so varied because, there is no way to curate and standardize the quality of the instruction. And it just becomes in practice like a chai samosa type of TADA kind of exercise, right? Having seen a bunch of these work in practice. So I think, so personally, I feel the piece that is missing, okay, is that even when we talk about training, most of our training focuses on the supply side, okay? What is the training program? What are we giving, okay? But what we are not institutionalizing is kind of why should the trainee take the material seriously, okay? And one simple idea I have, which is, see, doing performance-based career management in the public sector is very difficult, right? Because performance still depends on too many factors. And even though I have done studies on teacher performance pay, I don't recommend scaling it up yet because we just don't have the machinery to do that. But I think what is possible is to do for all public sector employees more of a competence-based career trajectory, right? I mean, whereby you need to basically, just like doctors every 10 years have to recertify themselves as kind of staying on top of your field and being able to kind of pass your qualifying exams, that if we can take the training content, imagine the following structure of teacher training, okay, that we already have Diksha as a portal where we are hosting a bunch of content. The main problem today is that, yes, we say people who are interested can go and access the content, but unless there is some, intrinsic motivation, people do this, but it is not institutionalized, right? So now imagine that the way we institutionalize the requirement of 20 days a year of in-service training is that every teacher has a unique ID, with which they have to log into the platform, and they have complete autonomy in picking what topic they want training in, right? Some might want training in how to teach a particular math topic. Some might want training in inclusive education. There are many. So that way you're still giving teachers the agency in terms of what they choose to learn. The portal on Diksha, because it's going to be crowd kind of, and there'll be, essentially crowd-based ratings that you automatically curate what is the best content so people have access to that. And then if you manage at the end of the content of every module to have a short test, right? Not a big test, just a short test, just like when we have any professional trainings, you have a short test just to make sure that you have shown that you have absorbed the material. Then what you can do is for every teacher in the system, you can say that, have you done your 20 days of this training? And then based on the modules that people have taken, those modules can kind of become courses and certificates that people collect. And coming to your point of communities of practice, it's not that difficult to say based on which courses online people are registering for, that you can create WhatsApp groups of saying here are 25 people or 30 people or 100 people across the country who are engaging with the same teacher training material. And then you have this community of practice and use technology as a way to create these virtual communities. But the important point is today what happens in government is even the best intentioned people sit there and do a bunch of supply-sided stuff, but without thinking about how do you institutionalize this so that at the level of the employee, that there is a professional incentive, right? So it doesn't have to be performance pay, but if at the time of your promotions, like, you say, okay, let's look at your training records, let's look at the modules you've done. And it also allows the self-motivated teachers and others over time to say that when there is a chance to be promoted to kind of a supervisory position, does my kind of investment in professional development in a demonstrable way matter in any way for my professional trajectories, right? So, and I think that's the piece that's completely missing in how we are architecting the system. But I think if you add that to the supply-sided initiatives, then you're likely to get a much bigger kind of bang for the buck.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks. Anurag.
So I know we're at time. So maybe I'll take a question on EdTech because, there were multiple questions on EdTech. And if somebody wants to ask it, that's fine. Or I can, just answer the question. Yeah. Because that was one of the early questions we had, right? I mean, do people think about education technology as the future? So, and again, as with all research, okay, the answer to this is it depends, okay? It depends in the sense that we have high quality evidence from randomized controlled trials on EdTech that has results that are all over the place. Okay, so we have in some cases strong positive effects. Many studies find zero effects, and some studies even find negative effects. Okay, so and the moral of the story again is that the design details really matter. Okay, and we cannot think about this as technology is going to solve the problem. You need to understand the production function of human development and saying what is the binding constraint and is the technology alleviating that binding constraint. Okay, so to give you an example of the studies that find negative effects. So negative effects were found in studies where middle school students were given free computers, okay, and said, here is a bunch of content you can access. But essentially they ended up playing a lot more computer games, okay? And we know, those of us who kind of have a hard time disciplining ourselves when we have the internet, that sometimes we would almost value not having the internet so that we can focus on work, okay? So that was examples of studies where giving the computers worsened outcomes. Then there are a bunch of studies like one laptop per child, right? Very, very high profile program in Peru, in many parts of the world that gave free laptops to students. And, the Asian Development Bank Inter-American Development Bank in Peru conducted a large-scale randomized controlled trial of the one laptop per child and found that it had zero impact. Okay, and the zero impact is because essentially this was a hardware intervention with zero integration with pedagogy. Okay, so there was this kind of somehow romantic idea that, bacche ke haath mein computer thama do, and then they'll figure out what to do. Okay, but it doesn't really work unless you have integrated the technology with the pedagogy. But on the other hand, the studies like we have done in Mindspark in Delhi and now in Rajasthan, where we get these stunning positive effects, you get these very large positive effects when you use the technology to customize the instruction to exactly where the student is, right? So if you're customizing the instruction, if you're increasing student engagement, if you're shortening the feedback loop between when I answer a question and the feedback I'm getting. So there are many, many, many reasons for why technology should have a big positive impact. But my main concern is when you look at a national edtech policy, the national edtech policy is still for the most part an input policy, right? It is saying what is the budget for computers, how many schools, how many computers, and that is the core of the policy in terms of budgets and procurement, but with very, very, very little attention to how are you integrating the technology with the pedagogy, okay? And so in my own fieldwork in Rajasthan, the same stories I would see in books, 20 years ago, you would go to schools and find these lovely books that they were getting, but the books would all be locked up, okay? And the children would not be allowed to use them because the teacher's biggest concern was if the books get torn, then somebody will come and saying where did the book go, okay? And similarly, when I went to these schools, they have gotten 6 computers, they have a computer lab, but it is locked, okay? It is kept locked and the key is kept with the headmaster. Why? Because the headmaster's biggest concern is what happens if a computer gets stolen, okay? Because that is what he's held accountable for. He's not held accountable for the usage of the computer for improving learning outcomes. He's held accountable for if it's lost, he's in trouble, okay? And to kind of, to show you that I'm not just doing academic research, right? I also have some time for pop culture. But if you saw the show Panchayat, right? I mean, that first episode, that first season of Panchayat, you have an entire episode called Computer Nahi Monitor, right? Where this poor guy is kind of being held accountable for the fact that monitor got stolen. And you can see how his life goes topsy-turvy because that monitor got stolen, right? And that is exactly what happens to a head teacher in a school that has a budget for a computer lab, because he has zero accountability for learning outcomes, but is held accountable for if it get lost. Okay, so, and it just gives you a sense of how the gap between policy and practice, right? Like, I mean, unless you think through the institutional incentives for every actor in the chain, the translation of what you do at the policy level into final impact, right, is always going to be weak. And so, as an economist, sometimes, there are many people in the audience who are probably wondering, we thought economists only focused on stock markets and investments and management, right? Like, but no, economics is everywhere. And for the students who are thinking about, research, like Raghuram Rajan was an MBA, like, and then decided, wait, like, there is greatness in economics research. So even if you're a business school student, right, you can still kind of make a transition to doing economics. And it's because economics is everywhere, right? Because essentially everywhere in life we face constraints. You have to optimize, you have kind of always more wants than you have resources for. And incentives matter at every part of the chain, including in EdTech, right? So anyway, so again, the point here is that the answer to almost any question is it depends on the details, and that the details matter, the incentives matter, and measurement matters. So, I'll stop there.
I keep on apologizing for taking more of your time, but I can't let you go without maybe one last thing from one of our colleagues, Professor Puneet Arora. Puneet, are you there? Puneet is our resident education economist, and he had some very interesting questions. Puneet, you want to come and ask that question?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Muralidharan. It's a great talk. While you've been into RCTs for long, I mean, I'm a budding RCT person. I'm trying my hands at it. So, I mean, my question sort of goes to the motivation story, wherein in your discussion, you mentioned that how people who are at the sort of top end of the big corporate houses and are Indians, and on the other hand, 60% of our people, I mean, students, they can't even read at their grade level. So, I mean, in this discussion, I mean, the difference is there in the motivation as well. Those students who are studying at IITs, who are probably going to the better end of the institutions of the nation and world, are more motivated than the rest of them. Probably due to, I mean, parental inputs, which, I mean, there's a whole lot of literature on that. School infrastructure, I mean, several factors could be a part of that. I mean, the hard actions that we've talked about in NEP probably will bridge some of that gap. But in addition, I mean, I do research in the behavioral side of economics. So from there, I mean, I believe there's a low hanging fruit in the sense that you can do simple sort of interventions in the form of a role model intervention, as I mean, it's being tried in several countries now, in several institutions. So such kind of interventions can, I mean, and not necessarily with sort of university students or secondary school students, when it comes to primary school students, because that's where, I mean, most of us felt is where the fault lies, I mean, in the education system. So maybe, I mean, you can't motivate those kids per se, but you can motivate their parents, because these kids are the first generation sort of school goers. And if you can motivate their parents by telling them, I mean, what lies in the store for their kids and for them, if the student sort of studies well. So let me, what is your take on that?
So let me give you two answers on this, right? See, I think, there is a bit of a double-edged sword there, right? Because what you see is that the parents' motivation is often based on saying, "Acha, ladka bada hoke, he'll get a government job." Okay, and so a lot of because the returns to education that people see come from the government job. Okay, so a lot of the frustration that you have with educated unemployed youth around the country today is because you have pursued education without skills, right? I mean, you end up in a situation where the market returns to your degree are really non-existent unless you manage to crack this government job, right? So I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Now, I agree with you 100% about the importance of motivation. And I also think that one of the things I like about, say, this apprenticeship-based training, which is something I think we can do with nurses as well as teachers, is that if you're using locally hired, okay, if you say, because there's I have a whole paper on public sector labor markets. And one of the things I think we have gotten completely wrong is the spatial misallocation piece. Okay, so what do I mean by this? is that we have a public sector recruitment system of saying we will take competitive exams and get the strongest candidates, and then we will post them where they are needed. Now, problem is the people who crack the exams are disproportionately from urban areas. And even if they're from rural areas, once you pass this exam and become a government employee, your social kind of peers and aspirations change. Okay, so a big reason for the absence is not that they are bad, is that but they're living in the city 15 kilometers away and commuting to the village where the job is. Okay, so whereas if you look at service delivery in India more generally, I feel that we will do a lot better by taking motivated local talent, right? I mean, and training them and upskilling them because they are connected to their communities. Okay, so if you look at the entire health space in India, the most successful part of the health system are the ASHA workers. Okay, and so this was a model that Dr. Abhay Bang and Rani Bang, like, working in Gadchiroli district in Maharashtra, in the search model. And they came up with this, which then got scaled up into ASHA. But the key insight is that you don't need this highly trained doctor, to come to the village, but you can take this motivated young woman from the village and provide enough skills to be a highly effective provider of local services, correct? So I think the other advantage of that model is that, remember, because these are disproportionately likely to be young women, so you're creating role model effects in a way that people can relate to, right? For the younger girls in the village, that you are seeing that there is a return to education and that becomes a role model. So I'm connecting my apprenticeship idea back to the role model point, right? I mean, that's another way of building the role model through what you see. Now, because sometimes having a role model of somebody who's achieved massive success in the world is often unrealistic, right? You want the role model to be local and you want the role model to be something that you feel you can achieve, okay? As opposed to saying, if you're a village cricketer and saying, okay, here is Sachin Tendulkar, sometimes it doesn't quite work. Okay, so now, but the other piece I want to say about motivation and connecting back to EdTech, okay, is that one of the big potential of EdTech, which I see in my own son, right? And I have a PhD student who worked on this a few years ago, is that what the EdTech also allows you to do is, see, let me ask you a completely different question. Okay, as a professor, suppose you had to decide between one of two models for motivating your students to study. Okay, one model is to say, I'm going to give you a final exam, and based on the final exam, you get your grades. Okay, the other model is to say that every lecture you need to have mastered the material of the previous lecture. Okay, and at the beginning of the lecture, I'm going to give you a test. Okay, to see if you've mastered this. Now, the thing is, the second model will actually work much better because you're forcing them to be continuous. Okay, but the reason we don't do that is, as professors, we don't have the time to use 15 minutes of every lecture to say, okay, now I'm going to conduct a test. Okay, because the measurement is costly, and therefore we say we will measure once at the end of the semester. Okay, but what the technology allows you to do is it allows you to sharply reduce the cost of that measurement. Okay, so now I can basically, if I have a question bank, I can tell the students, like, I'm just going to give you marks based on completion, not even on getting it right. Okay, so I'm encouraging you to put continuous effort, that you're working at least 15 questions a day you have to do. Okay, and the system will calibrate the difficulty. So now what you're able to do in terms of motivation is you're able, and it goes back to this point I made, that all improvements in productivity in society can usually be traced to better measurement. Okay, so if I'm reducing the measurement cost of measuring effort, you can write a better incentive contract to motivate, saying that I want you to do 15 questions every day. And that's the way the technology comes back into the motivation, right? In a way that you can implement. So I'll stop there, but you can see everything is connected, right? So you want the first principle clarity of what the constraints are, and then you think about the interventions of how they may alleviate those constraints and how you would structure a system to do that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Raghu Rangarajan is our colleague, our professor, our dean of undergraduate college, and also our friendly neighborhood cosmologist. Raghu, I think you have views on it. Can we close with that? Can we have you as the final word?
I see Raghu. I guess he's typing. Maybe his audio is not working.
Yeah, you're on mute now. Yeah.
Okay. No, thanks a lot for this really interesting presentation discussion. You mentioned something, and I want to ask you about the first generation school learners, first generation learners. What are practical ways of improving learning outcomes for these first generation schoolgoers? Would it just be something simple like homework sessions after school? Would that greatly enhance? And with some experience that I've had teaching some of these kids and talking to their parents, what I've realized is that parents don't even understand that just going to school and coming home doesn't mean that your child is going to get educated. And they have no understanding of what is homework and how you do homework. So if we also focused, and I think this is sort of impractical, but if we insisted that if your kid is going to school and neither of the parents is educated, then they have to also attend some adult education classes. Whether or not they get educated, I don't know. But they will at least understand that getting educated or trying to educate oneself involves not just attending class, but putting in effort after class. And then they could also monitor their kids' homework. Even if they don't understand the homework, they will know that, how you spend time on homework. And through that, the kids will also get a little more serious about doing homework at home because the parent is at least keeping an eye on them, even if they don't understand the homework.
Correct. And I think, so you've raised, I think, a very, very important issue. And so let me say two things, right? So one is, I think there are still school-based interventions that can be done, like say putting this extra teaching aid to support the small group instruction and potentially spending an extra hour after school, right? And doing that homework support right there. So in fact, if you look at some of the, the research on charter schools, right, which are, so the more effective schools in teaching low income and low SES students, even in the US, are exactly these schools that will have this extra hour or extra hour and a half. So normally you say, again, so this is exactly the way that our cognitive disconnect of an education system that is designed not for first generation learners, right? Because the default mode of instruction is teacher says, I will teach you material and then here is homework, right? But the fact that you need the cultural capital, to go do that homework, and that first generation learners don't have that, is something that is often not even in the consciousness, right? So, which is why some of the more effective models have then done like an extra hour or 2 hours in school, but then that requires the teaching resources, and there is that piece. But yes, that would be effective. Now, the other thing you're saying is, I think, absolutely right. And if you look at education research in the 1960s, there was this very famous Coleman report in the US that essentially was very depressing, because what it said was that 80% of long-term learning outcomes are determined in the household and not in the school, okay, which speaks to exactly what you said. Now, the reason that is depressing is, as a policymaker, normally you think you can only change the school. You can't change the household, right? The household is seen outside your domain of influence. And that was kind of the way we thought about education policy for a long time. Now, I think what is changing in the last 10 years is that because with mobile technology, you can reach the household, right? So a big part of this is the last mile problem, right? I teach in the school because I can't reach the household. If I could reach the household, I would try to reach the household. But now we're starting to see RCTs of simple text message interventions to parents of saying, have you checked your child's homework, right? Have they done this 15 minutes of work? So, and we're seeing this in the US. Now, in India, I haven't yet seen an evaluation of kind of reaching parents. But I think one of the things that's happening now in the context of COVID is we're seeing a lot more WhatsApp groups among parents. And, there are a lot of NGOs who are trying these kind of models. So I think there is promise, but I still worry that is excluding the 30% of the poorest who may not even have access to those smartphones and those platforms. And so we just don't know enough, right? So I think the potential is absolutely there. And I think this last point on adult literacy, again, I couldn't agree more. So there was an RCT done by Pratham on kind of looking at a mother's literacy program and looking at the impact of that on kind of the transmission through to children. And I think what they found was that the transmission to children was still limited. They didn't find big significant effects, but the effects on the mothers themselves was positive, right? And so to the extent that we care intrinsically about our adults, it's not like, we stopped caring about you once you leave the school system. So what, say, Rich Kothari at IIM Ahmedabad has been doing with his same language subtitling, right? A big part of that is about adult literacy through your chitrahars and through simultaneously engaging the visual and the auditory and the cognitive processing, processes. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be done, and we should not kind of somehow think that all of this action will happen only in the schools. You're definitely going to have potential to intervene in the households. But again, each of these things requires a lot of thought into details. And I think, so coming back to research, right? One of the things I want to say is that as an economist and a researcher, I don't have a comparative advantage in designing programs, right? So there are NGOs and civil society organizations who are on the ground, who have a much better heuristic sense of what kind of intervention works, correct? But the problem today is that we have tons of these localized interventions and we have no systematic evidence, right, as to what works. So where the partnership with research becomes very important is when you have a practitioner who's come up with a model that they feel based on their experience is sort of working. Then you want to bring in the quantitative researchers to say, okay, now let's actually validate, is this working? And then if it's working, we can think about what might be pathways to scale.
Thanks.
Okay, I think this could go on and could break Amit Verma's record on the longest interview with you, but we cannot. We will let you go and have your breakfast, Karthik, and we'll let our audience go and have their dinner. So thank you so much, Karthik. I'll hand you back to Sudhir to close the event now. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And thank you so much, Professor Muralidharan, for deep insight and at the same time for your generous time. We are thankful to you. And this is what we do at Ahmedabad University. We are not teaching and not doing research. We only talk about education and learning outcome and pedagogy. So this is what exactly we do. And we are very happy to have this talk, and the recording of this talk will also be circulated. And this is something that we would like to, people in fact would like to go back to and listen to again. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and take care, and hope to see you soon in our next conversation series. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and hope to be back in person in Ahmedabad sooner rather than later. And everybody, just please stay safe. These are troubled times, but safety first, and then we shall try to build back better, in multiple ways. And hopefully, this is the crisis that forces us to kind of reinvest in our public systems and do that, and do so in a thoughtful, cost-effective, evidence-based way. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.